Hello everyone, and welcome to our class video about simplifying square roots. Our learning goal is, you guessed it, that you will be able to simplify square roots. Imagine that! This is a skill that we're going to need once we get to talking about the Pythagorean theorem here in a little bit in this unit. So consider this as like a prerequisite skill to make your life easier down the road. Okay, so let's talk about how to simplify a square root. But before we get there, we kind of need to know, well, what is a square root? I mean, you guys have seen them before, but do you know exactly what they are? Let me just refresh your memory. So, before we talk about square roots, let's talk about what it means to square. Okay, so square as in 3 squared. Okay, so to square is to multiply a number by itself. So that is to say it has an exponent of 2. So in the case of 3 squared, that's 3 times 3, which is 9. Okay, so that's what squaring is. So now square root is the opposite of squaring, okay? So the square root asks the question, what number, when multiplied by itself, gives me that number? So, like, if I say square root of 9, that's asking what number, when multiplied by itself, gives me 9. Well, that number would be 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. You think you got it? So, let's try just a couple more examples. Okay? So, can you figure these out before I tell you? So, in example 1, we're doing the square root of 25. So this is asking what number multiplied by itself gives me 25. Well, that number would be 5 because 5 squared, or 5 times 5, is 25. In example 2, what number multiplied by itself gives me 100? Well, that number would be 10 because 10 squared is 100. Okay, kind of see the pattern? So numbers like 25 and 100 are called perfect squares because they're a result of multiplying an integer like 5 or 10 by itself. Some other perfect squares would be like 1, 4, 9, 16, and so on. Okay, so now what about like square root of 48? What number multiplied by itself gives me 48? Well, I don't know about you. I can't tell you that one off the top of my head. So, I know 6 squared is 36. So, 6 is too low. 7 squared I know is 49. That's too high. So, whatever number multiplied by itself gives me 48 has got to be somewhere between 6 and 7. If I use the calculator, I can figure out that the square root of 48 is 6.928203233 blah 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 blah. Okay, that number actually goes on forever. So if I were to multiply 6.928203233 blah 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 times 6.928203233 blah 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 blah, then I would get 48. Interesting, isn't it? Okay, so because it comes out to be a decimal, it's not as convenient to work with mathematically, especially if we want to have an exact answer and not have to round. So this is where we get to simplifying a square root. Okay, so let's simplify the square root of 48. I'll demonstrate to you the process. So the first and most important step is to find a perfect square that the number under the square root is divisible by. That means you can divide it by that number and get a whole number. Okay? So we're finding a perfect square it's divisible by. Remember, perfect squares are numbers like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, so on, so on, so on. Okay? So what's a perfect square that 48 is divisible by? Or will go into 48? Well, 4 works. So I can rewrite the square root of 48 as the square root of 4 times 12. Okay, then step 2 is to take the square root of that perfect square. And we're going to write it out front. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root of 4, which is 2, and write the 2 out front of the square root. I've taken the square root of the 4, okay, so it's no longer underneath the square root. Okay, but we're not done yet, because is there a perfect square that 12 is divisible by? Why, yes, 4 is a factor of 12. Okay, so I could rewrite the square root of 12 as 4 times 3. Alright, so since 4 is a perfect square, I can take the square root of it, which is 2, and I'll bring it out front. But wait a sec. There's already a 2 out there, so what am I going to do? Well, there's no addition or subtraction sign. This must be multiplication. So I'm going to multiply the two 2's and get 4. So the simplified form of square root of 48 is 4 square root of 3, or which means 4 times the square root of 3. Okay, you believe me? Well, let's check it. In the calculator, if I type in the square root of 48 and the 4 times the square root of 3, I get the same number. So, alright, I guess they're equivalent. So, we just simplified the square root. Let's look at one more example. So, let's simplify the square root of 50. Okay, so again, we need to find out a perfect square that 50 is divisible by. Perfect squares are like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. Aha! I've got it! 25 is a factor of 50, or I could say that 50 is divisible by 25. And I could write the square root of 50 as the square root of 25 times 2. Okay, so the perfect square here is 25, so that becomes a 5. Write it out front, and now I have 5 times the square root of 2. Well, there's no perfect square that goes into 2, so I guess we're done. So, the simplified form of the square root of 50 is 5 times the square root of 2. Think you got it? Alright, well, we'll see you during class. Alright, have a good one.